Hello, I'm Andrew Capio.
I'm Isabel Carlick.
And I'm Hannah Gibson, and today we will be talking about attitudes towards people with disabilities based off Dana Dunn's book on disability.
Looking at our first term, which is dual attitudes, the definition of dual attitudes is an individual may maintain different competing evaluations of an attitude object. How someone verbally expresses these thoughts about an attitude object may differ from their behaviors involving the same attitude object. The differing evaluations can be represented by two categories of implicit and explicit attitudes. Therefore, the term dual attitudes. One example of this could be how someone expresses their attitudes is different from the way that they actually behave on those attitudes, such as someone saying that they're very interested in seeing a movie, but whenever they're actually prompted with that activity, they do not follow through with what they had said on. Looking at explicit and implicit attitudes closely, we can look at explicit attitudes as controlled and conscious evaluations of an attitude object. So these are attitudes that we have a chance to think about before performing, and we have more time before actually acting on the attitude. When looking at an implicit attitude, these are more automatic and non-conscious responses to an attitude object. So these thoughts are more of a gut response and an impulse behavior rather than having the time to actually think about the attitude before expressing behavior on it. The attitude that people endorse depends on whether they have the cognitive capacity to retrieve the explicit attitude and if that is able to override the implicit attitude. Now looking how this affects other people, we're going to look at people with disabilities as an example for how these attitudes can affect others. Quoting from the book of Dana Dunn's A Social Psychology with Disability, non-disabled people appear to hold generally negative attitudes towards people with disabilities. These negative attitudes can negatively affect social interactions and prevent the integration of people with disabilities back into society. The source of these issues can be a result of minimal interaction with people with disabilities. So there's definitely a component of how much time you have spent with a person with a disability in the past as a result of the way you interact with them. Understanding these measurements of implicit and explicit attitudes is important because now that we have tests such as the IAT, which is the implicit association test, it's going to help measure these implicit and explicit attitudes on a closer level.
So the IAT test was looked at in a research study called Patterns of Implicit and Explicit Attitudes, and it's basically a computerized task that compares reaction times to categorize paired concepts and attributes. So if you're looking at the valence categories, age to say something good or bad, this study would ask, they would present target stimuli that were associated with both good and bad words. So for something like age, they would have either young and old and good and bad and associate those four terms in every configuration. So faster responses among paired blocks would indicate a stronger association of the social group, such as age, to the attribute good or bad. So looking at the results of this study, there were strong implicit preferences and explicit preferences for disability, body weight, and age attitudes. And for disability, skin tone attitudes, and age attitudes, there was a stable implicit-explicit correlation and no observed change in implicit attitudes. And for disability, sexuality attitudes had the largest overall change in explicit attitudes, and then the implicit-explicit correlation decreased by 18% for race attitudes. So kind of summarizing what these results mean, all explicit attitudes revealed a change toward neutrality, which indicates a decrease over time in self-reported prejudice across attitudes, so that implicit disability attitudes were stable over time regardless of the demographics. So relative to the stable attitudes, changing attitudes have a lower overall bias, higher implicit-explicit correlation, and higher perceived social priority.
So categorizing the results of the implicit attitudes in another way, we see that some attitudes moved toward neutrality, some were unchanging, and one attitude moved away from neutrality. And this perception can be based off the idea that people who fall into these categories have some control over the unchanging and the things that moved away from neutrality, like body weight, the perception of someone's age, and then also disability. And the attitude about disability being something that can be changed by the person with a disability stems back to people not having much interaction with people with disabilities. So interactions between others and people with disabilities can be broken down into three categories: family and friends, people who are medical professionals, and then the general public. The general public has the least interaction with an individual with disabilities because they are the largest group, and these attitudes are the most important in increasing advantages in opportunities in society for people with disabilities. So the goal in changing their attitudes would be to facilitate better interactions between people with and people without disabilities, and also increasing opportunity within society. So there are three hypotheses for changing attitudes towards people with disabilities, the first being the contact hypothesis. This is the idea that when people of equal status interact, one with a disability and one without, if they have a positive interaction, that helps to decrease any stigmas or misunderstandings that the person without the disability had previously before the interaction. However, as touched upon in the last slide, this cannot always be the case because people with disabilities do not always have contact with people without disabilities. So then we look at the extended contact hypothesis. So this would be including anyone in an extended social circle of the people with disabilities. They can go on to talk to others about positive interactions that they've had with people with disabilities, and this can be shown to decrease stigma in the same way that the contact hypothesis can. Again, this is not always possible in terms of there being a lack in interpersonal relationships. And so then we go on to the imagined intergroup contact hypothesis. So this would be actually imagining an interaction between someone that is different than yourself, and the interaction must be imagined, must include an interaction, must be positive, and must be between two people of equal status. And this has been shown to decrease negative attitudes and increase those attitudes toward neutrality in people without disabilities towards people with disabilities. Thank you.